was mentioning Phil, and he goes, "Oh, Phil's addicted to effort." Like that was his
Right.
like his line. I'm like, yeah, that's it. You nailed it on the head. He's addicted to
Yeah,
effort. Like
I
he just,
understand that.
oh, for sure. I mean, like
I
I
think you
don't
have
think,
to.
yeah, for sure. Like, well, the funny thing is, and I think like, like I don't know you. I know Gene. From talking with him, but like all three of you are like people who are just like, like I'm not leaving anything on the table. Like it is just going to go all onto the page.
Yeah, yeah, and I kind of I still work traditionally. So,
Yeah.
working on these black label pages that are, twice the dimensions almost of a regular comic book page, which is already,
Big.
twice the dimensions of a regular book.
Yeah.
Just sort of navigating, especially when you're doing double page spreads, which you've stuck these two giant pieces of paper together and
Right.
just swinging them around as you sort of navigate towards the four corners of what you've got to fill in with this
Yeah.
sort of incredibly dense and layered story with dozens of characters in it.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'd spend a week working on a double page spread.
I can't, I can't imagine. I was thinking when you're saying the size of the pages, and then I'm thinking like from Jaws, I'm like, we're going to need a bigger desk.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, 100%. The things that would go flying off my desk as I'd spin the paper around,
yeah.
just knocking shit flying everywhere. Sorry, I'm swearing so much.
No, swearing's okay.
Oh, thank God.
Thank you for joining me today, or
Oh, that's a
this
pleasure.
morning.
Thank you.
This morning for you. I mean, I was joking and half joking when I had contacted you. This idea of like speaking to people on the other side of the world is like time travel, because you really have to
Oh,
kind of,
yeah. I've spent like over 20 years now kind of navigating the time changes. Like, not only like when you guys go into daylight savings and we come out of it, and then when we go into it, and when the office moved from New York to LA, trying to sort of readjust that sort of, locked in idea of what the
yeah,
time differences are and what crossover I will have with the office when I'm awake.
right.
It's been very sort of, they were very when I very first started working at DC, I was still sort of FedExing like boxes of original art from
Mhm.
Australia to New York for like years. And,
Yeah,
very luckily, none of it ever went missing or
that's
got sort
amazing.
of, irreparably damaged.
Yeah.
But I was very lucky that at that sort of early stage of uh, sort of internet allowing people to not be in New York or necessarily in the States, that
Right.
they trusted me with a monthly book when I was on the other side of the planet, and they just had no real sort of safeguards. There was no safeguards.
No, not yeah. No, no, really, there wasn't. So let's dive right into that one, because I mean,
Sure.
I know, I got in the business in the old school traditional way.
Yep.
I was in New York. I hustled with editors and did the thing and got work. Um, and then, I'm, as the distance from the sort of the epicenter of what, the US comic market in New York City was, the stories become far more sort of like complex and interesting to me, because the
Right.
effort that is needed is way higher. And then to consider like, okay, now you're on the opposite side of this globe, and look, sort of entertaining this concept. How did you, like, was this something you were saying, hey, I want to go do this, or was it a sort of a happenstance where someone's like, hey, I really think you would be really good for this? Like, what was the connection?
Uh, well, I'm sort of like the same generation as you, the same generation as Phil, but I started a decade later.
Okay.
Um, and a lot of that was to do with the fact that I didn't really grow up with comic books. There were comics here,
Mhm.
and I remember when they started disappearing from the news agencies And, I later understood that they started, because comic specialty stores were how, it was sort of the diamond distribution
Yeah.
era, the beginning of that. I remember sort of them disappearing from my peripheral vision. But even when they were around in my childhood, I didn't really see anything that spoke to me in
Okay.
the same way that the film and the TV series in the 70s did. Like Linda Carter was my very first superhero.
Oh,
I
sure,
was
sure.
I
Yeah.
was 4 when it started playing on TV here.
Okay.
And it was such a sort of a life-altering event for 4-year-old me
Hmm.
that the sort of this reality of this sort of beautiful woman in this ridiculous costume jumping over cars and throwing around bad guys and deflecting bullets. I'd never seen anything like it. It didn't compute, but I knew it was 100% for me
Okay.
and that I was all in. And that kind of, it was like right at that sort of peak, not peak, that sort of really formative moment of sort of recognizing yourself as an individual person in the
Right.
world, that
Yeah.
you're not sort of attached to your siblings or your parents or you're this, that, and the other. That day was one of the very first moments that I realized how different I am from my sisters and my cousins. We all grew up together.
Oh,
And there's 6 of us, there's 6 girls, and the 5 of them, there's about 3 to 4 years difference in age between the 5 of them.
all right.
And then there's a 6-year gap before me. So I'm much younger than that posse
Oh, wow. Okay.
of kids who were all tweens when this Saturday afternoon was happening, and we were all sitting there watching, I don't know, Lost in Space or Gilligan's Island or whatever rerun was on Saturday afternoon. And when Wonder Woman came on was when I turned on as a person. I was suddenly like, what is this? And the 5 of them were just sort of like, hard pass, and left to, create havoc somewhere.
Right.
Um, and it was that moment that I sort of understood the alchemy of the TV guide. Like, if I work out what time it is now, and I work out what channel this is on, and I look for that time and that day and that channel in the guide, I'll find out what this is called, and then I can find it again.
Right.
And I with my dad's help telling me what the time was and what these words said,
Hmm.
I knew it was Wonder Woman at 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoons on Channel 10. And I was like, right. Our TV guide at the time used to come out on Sundays, and this was a Saturday afternoon. So
Right.
the next morning, I remember pulling out the TV guide and looking, same bat time, same bat channel, and there it was. And I was like, oh my God, I've worked it out. It was like a
You
freaking
cracked
treasure
the code.
hunt that I've discovered for myself.
Right. It's like, yeah, this is it. I can solve all the world's problems now. I know how to do
Oh
this.
my God. I was like a whole new person, and from there it's sort of, the Super Friends cartoon was not very far behind.
Sure. Right.
I started becoming aware of Batman TV show reruns.
Hmm.
The Superman movies were only a couple of years later. I was just all in on superheroes,
Yeah.
but my introduction and my access to them was all film and TV. And so I would be drawing as a kid who could draw
Hmm.
and was obsessed with these characters. I would be drawing the film and TV versions of them nonstop, or the sort of Super Friends version of them. Like Super Friends was a revelation because it taught me, that these characters knew each other.
Well, that's
And on
true.
the rare occasion, yeah, right. And on the rare occasion that I would see, Wonder Woman or Superman or Batman on the cover of a comic in the news agency, it was almost always something like Justice League or whatever, but they would be surrounded by, to 5, 6, 7-year-old me with no idea of comic books, by all
Hmm.
these random people. Like, who the fuck is Black Canary and who the fuck is Green Arrow? What are they doing here? They're not in the Super Friends. I don't know these people. And so comics sort of, I didn't feel like I had a relationship to the comics. I certainly didn't understand that they were the source material,
Right.
but they were just sort of like a something else that, even though it was drawings of these characters and I did drawings of these characters,
Hmm.
it was too otherworldly for me to sort of really get my head around. Even when I saw like Wonder Woman's solo comic,
Yeah.
um, the world that she inhabited wasn't the TV show world. And the
Right.
costume wasn't TV accurate enough for me. Kind of bullshit, you know. It's so,
Yeah.
so stupid.
Well, you'd have been a
And
horrible
so,
kid now. Think about it.
yeah, right.
Everyone's
Yeah,
so very specific now.
right. And so it wasn't really until sort of in the sort of post-crisis mid-90s era where, you know, I was sort of in my teenage years,
Hmm.
and you know, there was a guy that I had my Saturday daytime job, my weekend job. Um, a guy who was sort of maybe a year older than me, and he was deeply into comic books. And it was kind of through him that I got to clock like George Perez's Wonder Woman
Okay.
and um, Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. And they were so sort of radically different to what I had been familiar with from comic books,
Right.
and were so sort of way more sophisticated. And you know, me being in my sort of mid-teens was feeling like I was, you know, way more sophisticated.
Sure.
And it kind of really spoke to me. I had always been into Greek mythology, and it was the first time that I kind of properly put together that Wonder Woman and Greek mythology were sort of so intrinsically linked,
Hmm.
because George Perez's relaunch was so mythology heavy, um, that I did sort of get into that series, but only really as an observer. You know, it influenced how I would draw Wonder Woman. And I did show a bit of an interest in, you know, some of these comics that I became aware of and stuff, but it didn't at all seem like uh, it didn't occur to me that that was a job that I could do.
Right.
And it didn't become a sort of fantasy idea of a job that I could do. I just used to draw Wonder Woman in the margins of my homework and get in trouble for it. So, you know, it was that kind of setup. And certainly by the time I was a teenager, I was already sort of dead set on an acting career, having sort of, you know, started in theatre pretty young here. And I was at a performing arts high school, and, you know, it was just sort of, my whole life was geared towards an acting career.
Sure.
And I had these, you know, two older, very differently creative sisters who had had great early success in their careers. So I just figured, you know, they were very talented, but they also did the hard work. And I figured, okay, a bit of talent and hard work, and you get that career that you're
Yeah.
aiming for. So my singer-songwriter sister, you know, had a huge album thing happen in the late 90s and late 80s, sorry. And, you know, the appearance of quite a lot of success
Hmm.
when she was like fucking 19, 20.
Right. When you're
And
completely ready for it.
yeah, and my elder sister, who's a graphic designer, sort of left graphic design school and immediately got this incredible job because she was really talented. And the guy that gave her the job, who was a fashion designer at the moment, looking for a graphic designer, he was a big deal in the 80s, in the mid 80s in
Okay.
Australia. Um, he just took a shine to her and her art style and was just like, "You're fabulous. I'm going to give you the break that I wished I got when I was your age."
Oh my gosh.
So I know. So I just had this impression that
Good.
success just comes along when you're talented and hardworking enough. And my acting career just didn't go that way.
Mm.
And so after kind of a decade of you know, post high school graduating from high school where all of my acting teachers and every sort of acting tutor or sort of, a mentor outside of school had all said to me, "You've got it. You're the one,"
Okay.
kind of thing. Spending a decade sort of auditioning for fucking everything and then not getting anywhere
Oh,
was deeply sort of demoralizing. And like I wasn't really approaching it with any sort of real strategy because it just didn't know how to strategize. I hadn't learned how to
well, yeah,
strategize. No one in my family had learned how to strategize
right.
at that point because they'd been lucky.
Yeah.
Um, and so when I was 27, I kind of needed to, for my own just sort of mental health, just put acting away in a box. It was
Mhm.
actually a failed Wonder Woman audition that,
No.
just, yeah, 100%. The people that were making the Lois and Clark TV show in the
Yeah.
90s, once that wrapped up, they did a development for a Wonder Woman TV series, and they had a treatment, they had a pilot script, and I was auditioning from Australia, and I got, pretty far along.
Wow.
From what I understand, I was still in the running when the whole thing was scrapped.
Oh my God.
Um, and that was just it. I was done. It was like,
Yeah,
oh
yeah.
my God, I need to just put this career in a box under the bed for a while. I might come back to it, but in the meantime, I'm just going to, do something else. Which,
Right.
of course, being an actor, I was waiting tables and managing restaurants and doing the hospitality thing. And it really took about 18 months of me knowing that my other talents, like I come from a creative family, so it's really normal it would have been very odd for me to get an office job,
Right.
or a real job,
So, I mean, yeah, so like, I mean, when you're like, oh, I have these, five, let's just ostensibly call them your sisters, with your
Yeah,
cousins,
pretty much.
like the first thing that, I can envision this kind of like really like colorful chaos of that, of the volume of kids.
100%. Really loud, tall, bossy Australian women,
Okay, yeah. But
um,
that
none of
happens
which
in
have real
school,
jobs. Like one of them was a chef, one of them,
right?
another one was a graphic designer. That we all had creative careers,
And your
and
parents?
mine just wasn't. My mother was an artist and my grandmother
Okay.
was an artist,
Oh,
so our shared grandmother
mhm.
um was an artist, and my mother was kind of the more bohemian of the two sisters, like
Okay.
my mum and my aunt. um but we were a sort of generally pretty creative bohemian family, um and mine just wasn't panning out. And my sort of skills at that point and my sort of talents and my interests were sewing and drawing beyond acting. And at the time, I just made a pretty sophisticated wedding dress for my best friend. So my sewing skills were pretty decent.
Mhm.
Um, and I'd made sort of really fabulous costumes for theater. I'd made some really just, uh, you know, any size spray and wipe costumes for costume hire places.
Right.
Um, None of that particularly satisfied me, but I really explored every sort of possible career option I could find that sort of I was aware of that involved sewing or drawing
Right.
for about 18 months,
Okay.
trying to sort of find something that spoke to me that could use the skills that I had. And I just couldn't find anything that made me feel like I would really enjoy sitting down to do that all day and not become homicidal or suicidal.
Right.
And uh, there was just one morning when I was sitting down, I was living by myself at this point, and it was a Sunday morning. I was sitting down for, my tea and toast. And just once again, the sort of question came up in my head. I was like, what the fuck am I going to do with the rest of my life? 30's over there. It's not that far away.
Right.
Here it comes. What the hell am I going to do? And for the very first time in this sort of exploration, I changed the question in my head from what can I do with what I can do
Hmm.
to if I had to do the same thing all day, every day, what do I want to do? And almost immediately, as I sort of turned that question in my head, the answer was, I wish I could just get paid to draw Wonder Woman. And that was immediately followed by, oh my God, that's a job that someone's got right now because she comes from comic books. I
Yeah,
understand that. And comic books come out, you know, kind of all the time, right?
right.
I don't know. But right now, someone's getting paid to draw Wonder Woman. I want that job. I'm
Yeah,
going to do that. And I didn't know fucking anything about what that meant. I just, you know, I had
sure.
no idea how to do the job. I hadn't drawn very much in my 20s at all anyway. You know, having been a big drawer through my childhood and through my school years, I just, you know, I was too busy fart assing around in my
Yeah,
20s to sort of, you know, have the discipline to sit down and work to draw. But it was like, you know, I'm going to do that. And 20 minutes later, I was in a comic book store just buying anything that had Wonder Woman in it. Um, Anything that I liked the look of the art, that the art spoke to me.
right.
And immediately started chatting to the guy who worked behind the counter because, you know, he was my first touch point and was like, I don't know anything, so I just have to submit to the fact that I don't know anything. I know I'm going to ask really dumb questions. I don't care. I'm just going to have to go for it and and learn. And for the very first time, I kind of really triggered a hustle gene in myself.
Interesting.
And with a certain amount of ignorance and arrogance, I was just determined that this is what I was going to do and nothing was going to get in my way. Yikes. Um,
Right.
so
It's a
that's kind of how it
simple
started.
strategy. Like the plan is pretty simple, you know, like, okay, I'll gather some information, have a target goal. Now I just need to find the steps to get to that spot.
Yeah, and there was no pathway. You know, this
No.
is sort of early-ish internet days. You know,
Yeah.
it was way pre-social media. You know, it was the sort of early days of the sort of forums
Yeah,
that
sure.
we were on,
Yeah.
and you know, through sort of connecting with the guy who was working in the store, who's now one of my best mates and an incredibly successful children's book illustrator.
Okay.
Um, you know, he sort of was my entry point to sort of the local Sydney comic creator scene, which was teeny tiny and it was all hobbyists
Hmm.
because there's no real industry here.
Right.
And so it became clear to me very quickly that if I want to make a career out of this, I can't stay here because there's nothing to support it. Um, I have to go to the States, which seemed like a really, like, as soon as that occurred to me, it was like, yeah, a fucking course. Because I said to these guys, you know, how does anyone make a living doing this? And they were like, oh, forget it. You have to go to the States. And I'm like, oh my God, of course you do. Yep. All
Right.
right. I'm going to the States. And so, you know, at the time I was sort of buying Wizard magazine regularly because I needed to learn anything that
Sure.
I could about the business. And that was my access to information.
Yeah. No, that was
Um,
everything. That was everything.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in one of the, like, you know, the issue that I had that was relevant to that moment in time where I'm like, oh my God, of course I have to go to the States. There was a half-page ad for San Diego Comic Con, which sort of said the biggest convention in the world. And I'm like, right, okay, I'll go to that.
Right.
And so and
I
so I
love.
said to these guys the next time I saw them, it's like, have any of you guys heard of San Diego Comic Con? And they were like, oh my God, yes. Because even though it was like, you know, 20 something years ago, it
Sure.
was still a big deal that, you know,
Huge.
nerds over here knew about.
Oh no, it was massive. It was like,
Oh, yeah, it was
yeah.
fucking massive because when I went there, I was thoroughly overwhelmed by it. So I
Oh
just
yeah.
said to these guys, I'm just buying a ticket, I'm going. And, you know, I could buy a ticket online. There was a pretty dinky website for it at the time. And
Hmm.
this was back in the days where it was like, you buy your days individually, but if you buy all 4 days, you get to come to preview night for free, kind of
Right, on
thing.
Thursday. Is going on Thursday or whatever it was? Yeah.
Yeah, the Wednesday night preview night was
Yeah.
kind of like a bonus if you bought all 4 tickets
Yeah.
or 4 days. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to do that. Sure, whatevs. And I went that year. I think it was 2000 or 2001. It was
Okay.
2001, I think. Um, with my portfolio, that was very much a first timers. I have no idea what I'm doing portfolio.
Right.
Striding along, thinking, here I come, get ready
This
for
is
me.
it.
Getting a view of, what was back then a lot smaller than it is now, but still, to my eyes, absolutely fucking overwhelming.
Sure.
Seeing it on the horizon and just thinking, oh no. Because, like, the only conventions I'd experienced here to that point, there were two,
Okay.
and they were like in a conference room with about 50 people.
Right.
So I knew it would be bigger than that, but I didn't realize it would be as big as it was. And it
Like a
was,
small city.
holy shit. Yeah, it was really way more than I had bargained for. And it took me until Sunday to get the nerve up to show my portfolio to a couple of people.
What was your self-talk in that? I mean, because you were there, hey, you got the preview night, but I mean, you were there for like nearly, 3.5 days.
4.5 days.
Yeah, or 4.5 days, and so you're here at the last day, and your intention is, hey, I'm going to make my career begin here. Like, what was your self-talk? Because were you like yelling at yourself? Were you like, distracting yourself? What were you doing to like?
No, I'm tough on myself, but I'm not hard on myself.
Okay.
I'm not. I don't berate myself. I just, give myself a pretty tough pep talk.
Okay.
Which is what I did, because like for the first few days, I just needed to walk around and get some sense of the lay of the land.
Right.
Sort of finding that DC booth in the middle, sort of scouting all the guys with the headsets on,
Right.
just sort of like, right, they seem to know some things and have some clipboards and blah blah blah, and just sort of just acclimating really to this experience. And by the time Sunday morning had rolled around, I was just like, right, okay. Like I had some hangouts with some professional creators, I just sort of found myself at a dinner,
Right.
up in front of,
Yeah.
with people that actually did the business. And I'm just sort of like, oh my God, how did I get here? I just sort of, it was just sort of by accident. And then I was at the sort of, I think it was, being referred to as like the Marvel after party. It was just, someone's hotel room.
Right. Yeah.
Where everyone was,
Everyone.
drinking and
Sure.
chatting away and getting stoned and making out,
Behaving,
probably. I don't know.
behaving very well. Behaving very well.
Talking nerd stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
And I had sort of, as a single woman with no idea of who anybody is, I had sort of ventured into this going, I just need to set myself some rules. I'm sort of not going to drink that much. I'm 100% not going to get inebriated because I don't want to be making out with anybody. I need to be professional. So I was like, glasses on all the time. And I, rarely wore my glasses, but it was like glasses on all the time, hair back. I've got to look like I'm fucking here to work,
Right.
not
Carry
here
your
to hook up.
portfolio wherever you go.
Yeah, I don't want to find myself fucking my way in the middle. So it was like, hard rules.
Yeah.
Just to give myself some professional veneer, because God knows I wasn't a professional.
Mm.
And it was that final day where I was just like, okay, I've just got to just suck it up. I've paid all this money, I've come all this way. Just show your work to some people.
Sure. Yeah.
And my targets were the Wonder Woman editor at the time and the Batman editor at the time, because I had a Batman piece in my portfolio. And that was kind of it. It was like, if I hit those two targets and, bullshitted my way into those meetings, because I just sort of approached the guys with the headsets, knowing the names of these editors and saying, I'm looking for so-and-so. And they'd say, oh, there he is. Do you have a meeting? And I'd be like, mm-hmm. And they'd be, oh, he's just over there. like, great. So, doing that awkward shuffle of just sort of,
Yeah.
hovering around,
Yeah, yeah.
like waiting for their attention while they're just desperately trying to, not see you. Because it's
Yes.
like, oh fuck, there's another person that wants my attention. Um, but I showed my work to these two editors, and they were appropriately dismissive. But at the same time, one of them said to me, after flipping through this, really ridiculous portfolio that was very clear I had no idea what I was doing, um, and getting to this one image of Wonder Woman that was the only image in the whole book that looked like comic book art, that was like inked line work,
Right.
because everything else was paintings and pencil drawings, but like not properly finished rendered pencil drawings. Nothing had backgrounds. It
Right.
was just, it was real basic. But he said, that, do more of that. And I'm like, oh yeah, because that's the one that looks like comic book art. Of course. So stupid. But the next year I sort of, that was like a steep learning curve. And I came away from that going, well, that was devastating, but at least I know what to do for next year. I'm just going to come back next year.
Yeah.
And the next year I came back, and by that point I'd kind of learned a little bit what a proper portfolio is meant to look like. I think someone had told me sort of Joe Quesada's formula for a perfect portfolio.
Okay.
And I was like, right, okay, I'm going to aim to do something like that. And I had gone to the States like a month early, and had the very good fortune of being introduced to Jimmy and Amanda.
Oh,
And
okay. Yeah.
uh, they were really sort of generous and lovely with me. This is before Amanda was kind of working mainstream.
Yeah.
But Jimmy was obviously, super
Sure.
established.
Yeah.
Is Jimmy, right? And he was really generous. He sort of invited me around to their place for a day to just sort of go through my portfolio page by page, panel by panel, and just sort of give me some guidance.
Wow.
And he was great because he was like, you can clearly draw, and you understand perspective and 3-point perspective. You've got a good eye for it. But things like, you've done this sort of 3-point perspective, crazy view of a cityscape, but your buildings don't look like what buildings look like.
Right.
They look like building blocks. And I'm like,
Sure.
oh yeah. So he's like, go into Manhattan, get on some tall buildings, get on the rooftops, and start taking some photos of buildings, start taking some photos of rooftops,
Yep.
start, accumulating your reference library. Yeah, of course. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, that makes perfect sense to me. Don't just, make shit up and then get it all wrong.
Right.
So,
Faking it.
that started,
Yeah.
yeah, faking it. And it was like, so that started my architectural journey. But through sort of some of the specific guidance that he gave me, I had a bit of time to sort of get my portfolio quite a bit better than it had been only weeks earlier.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And Jimmy had said to me, this is the stage that you're at. These are the people that you should go and see. And he
Okay.
gave me a list of people, and he said, just tell them that Jimmy sent you.
Yeah.
So he'd sort of, very generously set me up with this sort of list of people that I should target. And out of that, I got like about 4 or 5 jobs. They
Yeah.
were tiny little, little jobs. But at this point in time, I'd drawn maybe 3 covers for stuff in Australia,
Right.
and maybe no interiors. I can't remember,
Yeah.
like I had not done nearly enough, but suddenly I was going to get paid to learn, essentially.
Mhm. Yeah.
Hilariously, one of the gigs was drawing a couple of things for How to Draw Comics book.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
And I was like, whoa, I can learn as I teach. So that was pretty amusing.
Do you know the?
But
Do
that
you
was
do
great.
you remember the guy's name for that book?
The How to Draw Comics.
Yeah. There's a guy who's done a whole series of those books. I'm wondering if
Yeah.
the guy.
I'm just checking if I have it on my shelves up there. No, I don't. Oh, that's
Okay.
really dumb.
Yeah,
Or
because
maybe
I have
I don't know. It's around somewhere. I probably gave it to somebody, like some kid in my life over the last 20 years to say,
Yeah, here,
Here, learn how to draw
sure.
comics.
Yeah, I did one of those books as in the '90s, and I forgot about it. And I was at an art store with my wife, and she was poking around getting stuff for herself, and I'm at the library side, and I'm like, oh, and I see the spine of the book, and I pull it out. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is the book that I did like a decade or so before, and I flip through it, and
Mm.
someone had actually there's a piece of paper in there, and someone was drawing the stuff that I had drawn, and just left a piece of paper in there, which I thought was really sweet. So
That's cool. That's
yeah,
so
yeah,
cool.
it's probably the same guy. I bet he's done like
It might have been. It might have been.
um
And during the sort of year between my second and my third San Diego, I lived in New York, sort of
oh
not full time. I was kind of, shuttling between New York and London, because I have a British passport and I have family there. So I was just sort of, spending as much time in New York as I could get away with,
yeah,
and just sort of trying to absorb myself in the culture as much as possible, living out of a suitcase off, anyone's generosity and a couple of bucks that I could scrape by here and there. But just sort of really focusing on spending as much time awake working as I could to build as quickly as possible a body of work
right,
and a fresh portfolio full of published material for the following year. And when I went back for my third San Diego, I had like quite a sort of interesting portfolio full of stuff, with one piece that I'd created specifically for the portfolio, which was a Wonder Woman story.
hmm
Because I would always get a good reaction from my Wonder Woman art. They'd say to me, "Oh, you draw a great Wonder Woman." So I was like, that's one way to get an easy sort of tick from anyone that I'm showing the portfolio to. And when I went to that third show, sort of doing that hustle of trying to get into the portfolio review sessions, which just getting on the list was, required all kinds of bullshit getting in the door early enough to get on the list, because I
right,
didn't have a professional badge. Or an exhibitor badge.
yep,
This was sort of real hustle stuff that you just would not get away with anymore. And I got onto a Dark Horse portfolio review up in the sales pavilion. And when I went up there on the afternoon of that day, it was like, I don't know, Saturday, like one of the big busy days. There were 20 slots for this hour-long portfolio review, but there were like easily 100 people crowded around
okay,
waiting, just in case someone
so,
hadn't shown up and there were slots available. And they had very cleverly put one of their top Star Wars artists, I believe, just sort of into the crowd, kind of roaming, doing little mini reviews as a professional.
okay,
It was like, and the smartness of that was to just kind of thin the herd a little bit.
sure,
And it was smart because it worked, because the first person he showed it to, who he sort of did a portfolio review of, he just sort of picked them randomly. He sort of announced himself and said, can I look at your portfolio? And he sort of flipped them through and gave them some advice and then sent them on their way. And
right,
then the second person, he sort of flipped through, and a few people are sort of creeping over to sort of have a look at what he's looking at and hear what
yeah,
he's saying and all that kind of stuff. And, again, gave them some really structural advice and then sent them away. And then he sort of turned to me, because it was happening right next to me, and because I was one of the people sort of, hovering like, oh, fuck, what's he saying? He turned to me and said, "You're next." So I was like, oh, shit. And he pulled my portfolio over. And by this point, there was a
the
full
crowd,
crowd, a
yeah,
full scrum around us. And he's flipping through and he's going through quite slowly and he's not saying anything. I'm like, oh, shit, this is
oh
really
no,
nerve wracking. And then he got to the end and he said, "Okay, did everybody see that? If your portfolio doesn't look like this, you shouldn't be here." And
wow,
that was a huge relief, but it was also quite sort of terrifying. It was a terrifying experience. And then he turned to me, once sort of everyone had sort of dissipated, he turned to me and said, "What are you doing in this queue? You're a professional. I'm like, no, I'm not. I just don't know anybody. And
Right.
this is my only access. And he was like, okay, well, look, you don't need to be here. I'll just set up an appointment for you with the editor.
Right.
And you can just, see him once he's done here. So, go get yourself a drink and come back in an hour. And so that's what I did. And I came back in an hour and I sat down with the editor, and he sort of very casually flipped through my book without paying too much attention to it. And then said, so if I were to email you a script, when do you think you could start on it? And I was like, well, I'm flying home to Australia, in 2 days. So I can start in 3 days. And
Hmm.
he was like, okay, there'll be a script in your inbox.
Wow.
We just happened to have an opening on, a Star Wars comic that we need to have filled, like right now. So it was just really good timing.
Is that when you said, so what is Star Wars?
No, I knew Star Wars. like Superman and Wonder Woman, Star Wars was, a big part of my childhood and part of my sort of, formative passions. And
Yeah.
so that was like a serious professional job that was paying me serious professional money.
Yeah, I mean, that's full rate. That's Dark Horse. That is, sort of the benchmark when it came to the indie world.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
could say to all of my like non-nerd friends, all of my theater and film buddies, hey, I'm working on Star Wars, and they knew what I was talking about because
Sure.
everything that I had said to them previous to that, I'm working in comic books and I'm working on this random thing. They'd be like,
Right.
yeah, whatever. But as soon as I said Star Wars, everyone would be like, oh shit,
Yeah.
right, that's a real thing.
That is,
So,
it's a really interesting. Yeah, it is interesting because the cachet of the brand names that everybody knows around the world when it comes to, Wonder Woman or Star Wars or Spider-Man or whatever those things, people go like, wow, that's a thing. Like they know what that is, and there's
yeah,
value to it. It's, so
it gave legitimacy to my random in their eyes endeavor.
Oh, for sure. I mean, because it's like, I mean, I've said it before. I have older sisters. I have because of marriages, I have 7 older sisters, or 6 older sisters and 1 younger sister. And
right.
And one of them said to me, he's like, "Oh, when you were 11, you just like turned to us and said, well, I'm going to draw comic books." And they were like, I was speaking, Arabic for all intents and purposes, because it made no sense to them. They were like, this isn't a thing. Is it a thing? Like, how could that be a thing? Like, there's super friends, and then that's it. So
yeah, right.
It's super big. So okay, now you're, what is this, 2003? You're hopping on a plane. You're going for that quick flight back to Australia. I mean, you must have just been over the moon.
Oh yeah, 100%. Because apart from the fact that I suddenly felt sort of validated.
Yeah,
right. I certainly hadn't felt like I'd earned it, but I'd been pushing so hard, even though it was a short period of time. I've been really hustling myself really hard, that it just sort of felt like, okay, I can do this. I'm on the right path. And it sort of suddenly gave everybody here, all this sort of, really talented writers and artists who sort of had the fantasy of the idea of working in the American industry.
Yeah.
It suddenly seemed like a real possibility,
Sure.
a real option, because certainly from then on, for like at least a decade, like a whole posses of Australians would be hitting up San Diego Comic-Con, because it was like suddenly a possible doable thing.
Look, it's the 4-minute mile, Nicola. That's what it is. Like, you ran the 4-minute mile, and everyone goes like, but that was impossible. But it's not impossible, so I guess we can do this too.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And there was a period of time, sort of, over the last decade, where at any given stage there was like about 7 or 8 of us working in the American business.
Yeah.
Which was fucking phenomenal. It's coming and going these days. Tom and I are really the only regulars. Tom Taylor and I are really the only regulars. But, we've got sort of John Sommeriva doing bits and pieces. We have Andrew Constant doing bits and pieces. We have David Yarden doing bits and pieces. We have Tristan Jones doing bits and pieces. There's a sort of a collective of us here that are each other's sort of little support network.
Is it, if I'm totally but isn't Ashley Wood in Australia?
Probably.
Yeah, yeah. I think he sort of kind of hit around that time as well, but not mainstream, like kind of doing
Right.
his own thing. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, wow, yeah. But that's, I mean, that's just super exciting. So, how, like, I mean, were you like kind of terrified by this idea of the script landing in the inbox, and like, and how did you face it? Because it's been 3 years of just kind of making it up
Yeah.
to, like sort of, making that sort of that parade float of your portfolio to like, okay, here's the show, it's gonna hold together.
Yeah. Well, by that point, the only sort of sequentials of any length, like shorter than a short few page story, I had done one full issue of a vampire werewolf indie comic
Okay.
and 3 10-page stories for an online indie comic. So I had accumulated 52 pages
All right.
of interior art.
Yeah.
But it was like, I know these characters. It was this Luke Skywalker story.
Sure. Okay, cool.
And it was like, I know these characters, so I can just shut up and do it. And I did just shut up and do it. And I like it. Fear to me is energizing rather than, I don't shrink from it. I kind of rise to it. And, I find anxiety a useful tool rather than a hindrance tool. So I just got on with it. I didn't sort of really properly, I didn't know how long it would go on for. Like I did a few issues of Star Wars Empire, and then I did a one shot that was specifically for Free Comic Book Day. That was an Anakin and Obi-Wan story. And was that it? I think that might have been it. Like it was about sort of 4 or 5 issues in total of sort of Star Wars material. And then, the person who I had been filling in for had come back by this point while I was working on the one shot. And so I was kind of free floating again and on call at Dark Horse. And by that point I was getting close to coming back to San Diego, and I got a whole lot of IDW work and God, I can't think. I did some stuff for Image, and I did some stuff for, who else is there? I pretty much sort of worked for everybody but DC and Marvel at that point.
So were you penciling and making your stuff at the time?
Nope, I was just penciling.
Just penciling. Okay, yeah, because it's was it something you were shooting for, or did you just kind of go like whatever they were going to give you, you're going to take?
I didn't feel terribly comfortable inking. Like at the time, it was still in the period where the status of inkers was still really super significant.
Yeah.
Certainly the inkers were on the cover credits.
Right.
And colorists were nowhere to be seen.
Who?
And I'm pretty sure most of my Dark Horse material went to color from pencil.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I don't think it got inked. And I don't know if that was necessarily a common sort of Dark Horse thing, but I do really tight pencils. So I don't know if it was a timing thing or a budget thing, a timing thing because I was so far away and I had to sort of FedEx stuff, and that sort of lost time as art was in travel. Or if it was just, you've got tight pencils, we don't need to ink these.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
No, I mean, that is certainly not common. I mean, there's only a handful of artists that I know, classically Gene Colan, I think, was like the first of the artists that they just did that work for, because frankly, his stuff is impossible to ink. So they were like, let's just do it that way. But that's pretty interesting. So, but that was just kind of a one-off with Dark Horse doing the pencils to finish?
Yeah, there was uh, a bunch of things that I did for IDW, sort of like Buffy and Angel comics.
Okay.
Just trying to think of what else I did at IDW. Anyway, and the first of those projects was a one shot for one of the Angel sidekicks, and I had decided that I would do it in ballpoint pen because I wanted a sort of grittiness to
Okay.
it, and uh, I don't know that I asked this necessarily, and maybe they just asked for inks, and I was like, oh, fuck, how am I going to do that? Because I'm not comfortable inking line work with a brush. So I was like, I'm just going to do it in ballpoint pen. That's what I did in high school. Let's go.
Wow.
And it sort of provided a grittiness that I think really worked for the story. And I was sort of, it was the character Illyria that Fred turns into in season 5. For all you Angel fans out there. And she sort of wears this, the character Illyria, the sort of demigod character, wears this sort of very textured looking leather jumpsuit. And so once I had drawn this whole thing, I was then just sort of drawing ballpoint pen on my fingertips and sort of putting all this texture
Sure.
onto the jumpsuit to sort of give it some depth and texture and weirdness.
Right.
And then on this sort of black line areas, sort of doing the same thing with like a white pen and sort of, smudging it into the costume to sort of give it an otherworldliness. But I think I sort of stayed in with a ballpoint pen on all of my IDW projects after that.
Oh, that's pretty good. That's so cool. And it's so like kind of like gutsy just to kind of like jump into that. But I think it's also like that, that whole thing about like the naive point of view of an artist. Like if you don't know, like you solve the problem in some fashion.
Yeah.
And if the problem gets solved and it's aesthetically pleasing, then like it doesn't matter that you
then
did.
It works.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. When I told some of my mates, oh, I inked it in ballpoint pen, they were like, what the fuck?
Right.
I was like, well, it was what I was comfortable with and it worked.
Right.
Like, yeah, it did actually.
You do some, I mean, you're like, your work has, you do these great tonal pieces with your work, like your ink, like I guess ink washes or whatever. I don't know what you're doing for washes. So like I can kind of see like with the ballpoint pen, because for some reason, a ballpoint pen, you can get that real light thing and you can get that real heavy thing.
100%. That's why I've been thinking about working with a ballpoint pen again recently. Just sort of thinking if a project comes along where I think it's appropriate, I'm 100% going to buy a box of Kilometros or whatever and just go for it.
You should talk to Jim Rugg.
Oh, really?
Well, he loves the ballpoint pen. He does all those great cover pieces and ballpoint pens. They're beautiful.
I love a ballpoint pen. Yeah, I'm into it.
Yeah. That's amazing. So I guess because like there's so many kind of cool things like you like artistically, like you've got this great, what I feel is like this great sort of influence of Perez's sensibilities, like with his work. But I also see like Jose Luis Garcia Lopez. I don't know if you know, like,
yeah.
I just see this interesting hybrid between the two, like in influence coming along on the page, which I think is just kind of perfect. Like, when it comes to like those two people. But like,
appreciate that. Thank you. A couple of legends.
I know, total legends. But the tonal work you do is really, really very, very much outside of that. And I it's like, from when I see that, like, I mean, I remember when you were posting stuff for Historia, like you're doing the headshots, and I'm like, man, like this feels like I'm looking at like Alphonse Mucha like paintings, like that real beautiful tonal work that he does, but it's all like color containment, and it's just that really like,
oh, thank you.
Yeah. So let's just hop up to Historia, because I'm just so like, I mean,
sure. Yeah.
So totally fat. I love this project. I was drawn into it just because of Phil Jimenez being sort of an old friend, and I'm like, I'm really happy to hear like that he got to do this sort of I don't know, like I don't want to say like a coda to his sort of Wonder Woman-ness, but kind of a coda to his Wonder Woman-ness.
100%.
Yeah.
This is a story that hasn't really been told before,
No,
except in shorthand. It's always sort of an abbreviated history to get to Diana as quickly as possible and to
sure.
get Diana in the Wonder Woman outfit as quickly as possible.
How
You
could
know?
you in that costume? Yeah. And so it's like one of these things where I'm like, okay, cool. Like, and like, Phil would kind of blew the doors out for Phil, became a digital artist in the process, like all these things that like
Yeah.
he'd never done before. And it was an amazing thing. And then he's like, yeah, but I'm not doing the next one. And I'm like, what? You're crazy, And then like Gene comes on board and, Gene's Gene, like,
Yeah.
you know, and, and then, and then they're like, oh, and then you're coming on board. I'm like, oh my God. Like it was so interesting. Like because the three are, you guys are not like, it's not like sort of like, one, two, three, okay, yeah, you all live together in the same sort of artistic world. You don't. Like it's
No.
very much distinct. And Kelly, I mean, Kelly Sue's is sort of like a great sort of like anchor and pivot point, with her story and her personality drawing this sort of project together. So how did the project come to you?
Right.
Yeah.
Uh, well, I think sort of somewhere in the doing of the first volume, um, however it had come about, it was clear that Phil wasn't moving on to the second volume,
Right.
which doesn't at all surprise me. It is so dense. There
Yeah.
is so much work, especially that he's put into it. Designing these 30 goddess created Amazon characters that he kind of didn't really get to play with. He got to design them, and a few of them appear in a scene at the end of the book,
Right.
and that's kind of it. And uh but the kind of care and consideration and research and depth of understanding and knowledge that
Yeah.
he had put into those 30 designs is so dense and rich, and kind of, for someone that then has to reference them, is kind of overwhelming, because it's like, oh my God, okay, so much material here.
Right.
And for me, kind of drawing the book, Jing got to have essentially, it was this sort of, Phil's doing this sort of grand scale,
Right.
God level story
Mm-hmm.
that in the last third kind of narrows itself down to one human character and the tragedy that sort of sets the longer story in motion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Phil's story, Jean's volume is this sort of really grounded, earthbound for the most part story, where
Yeah.
the gods are sort of reasonably esoteric and not necessarily present, but constantly, magically present and alluded to. But sort of this sort of very human story of Hippolyta and all of these, human slave women that she's accumulating, with
Mm-hmm.
a little bit of Amazon, goddess created Amazon assistance. But still, he's only sort of showing like the queens of the tribes and a few others.
Yeah.
My volume was about all of these various factors of the sort of goddess created Amazons, all of the gods and goddesses, and all of these now, human tribe of Amazons, all coming together. So it was like cast of a billion people, all of which have really sophisticated designs unto themselves,
Yeah.
and stories and body language and, all of this kind of stuff. And draw them all going into battle
Right.
nonstop.
Yeah.
And it has been a lot. But how it first came to me was I think when Phil had sort of, however the decision was made that Phil wasn't going to move on to volume 2,
Mm-hmm.
the editor kind of reached out to me to sort of say, hey, this is something that's, on the schedule. Would you be interested? To
Wow.
which I was like, I'm unbelievably interested,
Yeah.
despite the fact that, I'd be terrified to follow Phil, because yikes. I had seen some of the work that he had been doing and releasing, and just sort of being thoroughly overwhelmed and excited by it, but just sort of like, oh fuck no, I don't want to follow that. And also, luckily at the time, I felt my schedule was jam packed, so it was
Mhm.
like, oh look, I would love to, as terrified as I would be, um, but I actually can't fit it in. So thank you for thinking of me, but I have to pass. And so I think it was probably about 6 months later, and the editor came back to me and said, hey, just seeing where you're at, because we're starting to sort of plan out for volume 3. Do you think you'd be interested in being able to do volume 3? To which I was like, oh, okay, so there's more volumes, and it's not, it sounds like it's a new artist every volume. um but again, unfortunately, I can't do it. I can't fit it into my schedule. I'm so sorry. I wish I could, because it sounds like an extraordinary project. I wish I could be part of it, but I can't fit it in. And another 6 months or so go by, and the editor contacts me again and says, look, I know you're going to say no, but just on the off chance, do you think you could fit in volume 3? To which I was like surprised that volume 3 was still on the table, because quite a lot of time had gone by.
Yeah.
And I was like, look, you know what? If I can, it was like February last year. And I
Hmm.
was like, look, I can't start until August, but I have an opening come August. So if it can wait until August, then yes, I can do it. And I would love to. And he said, August is perfect timing.
Wow.
We're booking you in. And then come October is when I actually started. Spent a couple of months twiddling my thumbs waiting for the ball to get rolling. And then I started, and straight away it was just sort of, by this point I'd seen all of Phil's volume. I'd
Mhm.
seen maybe 85% of Jean's volume,
Right.
and I could see how they were quite different.
Hmm.
Um, not only in art styles and sort of approach to the sort of esoteric nature of quite a bit of the story, but just sort of tonally, that each volume
Yeah.
was different. The second volume was quite different from the first, because of its primary context
Yeah.
of centering on Hippolyta and her personal mission,
Yep.
made that story sort of really intimate by comparison to this sort of, overwhelming sort of universe that Phil was working in.
Right.
And it was clear from the very beginning that mine was going to have to be a meld of the two, that we were going to have these sort of very intimate, um, earthbound, ground level taking place with these sort of extraordinary Amazon characters mixing with these very human characters. Um, and also a lot of God shenanigans happening above it.
Yeah.
And and sort of how to approach that, bringing something fresh to the table while also really trying to incorporate Phil's intention and designs and Jean's intentions and designs. And um, that became a sort of real sort of creative chrysalis. It was a lovely spark to sort of feel like, okay, this, I'm enjoying the sort of parameters that have been set up, so that I can sort of play with these pieces and see if I can bring something that relates clearly but is also fresh.
Did you set up any sort of like, using drawing back to your must appear like a professional artist when you were at your
Mm.
first San Diego, hair in the back and a ponytail. Like, did you set up a bunch of sort of frameworks for yourself as how you were going to approach this like visually, because of this task that you needed to sort of accomplish, which neither one of the two previous guys had to do that because they were sort of telling two very different tales.
Yeah.
And did you say like, okay, so I need to be able to incorporate, this sort of like cinema, I don't know, like cinematography, within the storytelling that Gene has, and then I also need to kind of pull in this, like, I don't know, like,
Yeah, well, it was a sort of, you know, ephemeral combination of things, this sort of alchemy of sort of trying to sort of pull in all the right things. So, Gene had established in his volume, in the sort of second half, last third of his volume, this sort of setting for the seventh tribe, Hippolyta's, human Amazon tribe. But he only sort of had an opportunity to show a couple of these spaces, and only sort of once or twice. So straight away, and because his story was way more intimate, we were sort of right in the spaces rather than looking at the spaces.
gotcha.
Quite a lot. So I had to sort of find a way to, my approach was to sort of go grand scale in terms of how I would visually tell the story, because that's where my volume's going to go. But so I was sort of zooming in and out quite a lot. Phil's was sort of zoomed out a lot,
Sure,
except
yeah.
for his sort of really, really sort of big character moments where he'd have a double page spread with just Hera walking into a building,
Right.
looking extraordinary. But a lot of his imagery was sort of really zoomed out to sort of really enhance that sense of scale.
Right.
And Gene's story was zoomed in to sort of really bring the intimacy of Hippolyta's plight. And for me, I was sort of like, okay, well, I can just zoom in and out as necessary. And a lot of our setting is this sort of space that Gene has established, but we don't yet know how these sort of various little bits and pieces of setting relate to each other. So straight away, I was like, somewhere early on, I'm going to have an establishing shot of the full lay of the land, so that we can see how this sort of water's edge piece of architecture relates to this building's piece of architecture, relates to this ruined temple, relates to, these sort of disparate pieces. At some point, I'm going to have to sort of zoom out so I can show how they relate, because a lot of our story is going to happen in this space.
Yeah.
And fortunately, as Kelly Sue had written the script, one of the early scenes, it certainly wasn't the first scene, but one of the early scenes is a sunrise scene taken, seen from a vantage point. And I was like, okay, so I'm just going to set it up high enough, and a high enough vantage point that we can see the lay of the land, that the characters can see this lay of the land as they watch the sunrise.
Yeah.
And so, I'm sort of, I have that ability to sort of zoom in and out of these sort of really intimate, concerns that these characters are having as the story unfolds on them, while also wanting to sort of highlight the scale of the story and increase the scale of the story as it continues to play out, because it has to escalate. And that escalation is something that was sort of, because we were working on it for such a long period of time, trying to sort of stay on top of all of the moving pieces and making sure I'm sort of escalating in the appropriate way was sort of something to keep my head around, because even though it's only 60 6 pages, our volume 66, not 64. Um, I spent 14 months working on it. So,
Right. Well,
uh,
how did you prep that? I mean, how did you I mean, what was the back and forth? What was your development process with so were you was there a lot of sort of like roughing, structuring these pages out and seeing if they
uh, yeah, kind of. Before I'd even started, I had a really, really long Zoom with Kelly Sue as she sort of talked to me about the greater idea of the project
Mhm.
and its genesis and her goal for it and this, that, and the other, and then sort of focusing on the sort of specifics of Phil's volume and Jean's volume and the intention of the third volume. So I had a sort of broad idea of where it was going, where we'd end up, kind of the triggers of how we get there. But of course, none of the specific, moments. Um, and then when script started coming through in a sort of totally practical, sort of technical sense, my general version of working is when I'm working on monthly books and I've got a full script in front of me, I will read through the full script. So I've got a sort of real sense of the ebb and flow
Yeah.
of the issue and where the peaks and troughs are, and try to sort of find my way into the mood and tone of each scene. And I act out all the parts and, I'm sort of getting as broad and big an understanding of the issue as possible so that when I sit down at my desk, I tend to just thumbnail a scene at a time,
Okay.
or sort of like a series of scenes if they specifically relate to each other. But I will only thumbnail a scene at a time because I will start not being as creative
Hmm.
if I thumbnail the whole thing at once. I'll
Right on.
sort of I'll dry out my creativity. I need to keep it sort of fresh.
Yeah.
And part of my general process, certainly when I was on monthly books, was every 5 day for 5 days I work on a 7 day cycle. For the first 5 days of that 7 day cycle, I would start a fresh page. So I would thumbnail, I'd rough, and then I'd start on my finished pencils or my finished inks, until the day was done, and then I'd put it aside, and the next day I would start completely fresh on the next page. So I had some sense of momentum.
Interesting.
And by the end of 5 pages, I had 5 pages that were, approximately 80% done.
Okay.
Some of them were a lot further in, some of them were a lot less further in, some of them just needed a couple of backgrounds, some of them needed like, here's where you have to really suck it up and draw a 3-point perspective,
Sure.
double page spread cityscape, this is where you're going to spend your day. And those final 2 days of that 7 day cycle would be catch up. So I would be able to get those last 20% done of those 5 pages pretty
Mhm.
quickly. So I constantly had a sense of momentum. With this, because the scale of the pages is so big, and because of the nature of the story, even if it's just one or two characters talking, there's always dozens of characters in the space.
Right.
I just knew that, that kind of schedule isn't realistic at all. So I'm going to have a penciling day, an inking day, and a painting day.
Hmm.
And I will start by penciling, like roughing out 5 pages, or I'd rough out a scene. I wasn't really
Yeah.
doing 5 page blocks at this point. It was like, a lot of our scenes were like, say 3 pages kind of thing. So it's like, or 2-3 pages a scene. And so, it'd be like, okay, I'd do a block of like 5 or 6. And I would do that thing of like every day I would pencil, I'd rough out a page. Then the next day I'd rough out the next page, rough out the next page, rough out the next page. Then I'd go back and I'd ink out the page, I'd ink out the page, I'd ink out the page. And then I'd go back and I'd paint, you
Yeah.
know, the scenes, because I was painting in grayscale. And that sort of became a pretty sort of doable keeping it fresh, keeping it sort of tight, keeping me on target process. That I didn't really sort of get to implement that kind of creative flow until
Mhm.
like the last quarter of the book, because we were sort of working in tiny segments at any given stage with breaks in between. So I was kind of losing my creative flow every time, and needing to sort of get back up into gear again. But for like the last 15 pages, 15, 17 pages, it was like suddenly here was a bulk of script, and it was like, right, okay, now I can really get going on a loop,
Yeah.
um, which is my kind of preferred way to work.
Uh,
Uh,
that
and yeah, sorry.
no, no, that's interesting. So, I mean, you sort of had to kind of, I mean, become your own kind of production line to be
Yeah,
able to sort of handle the volume of this, because
yeah,
because not only was it, you know, a long issue, it's also big pages. So there's
big
not a
pages and quite dense. You know,
right.
each page is relatively dense.
It's like X, Y, and Z. You know, like the X
Yeah,
and Y were big, but because of this density that you had to achieve within the amount of characters, the amount of information, the amount of tone that you had to put into this, that depth, really, that Z factor comes, in heavy.
yeah.
Wow. Okay. And so, I mean, you said over a course of 14 months, like that's a long time, working on a project.
It was a long time.
Yeah, no, no, no. It's like
I'm still in recovery.
the emotional attrition that something like that takes, because it's not like, because there's people who are graphic novelists who do, like, I did 200 pages, and in that same amount of time that you've done it,
Mm,
but they're not doing the same kind of work, but they're moving through, there's this sort
yeah,
of long, sort of like, oh, I've done 120 pages. I mean, I could see like the weight of having to go back and look at that same page the third time, you know
it
after
was a
you've already
lot.
passed it in,
Well,
in ink.
considering 14 months, if you're working on a monthly book, in
Right.
14 months, I wouldn't necessarily get 14 issues done, but I would get,
10. Oh,
maybe 11 or
yeah.
12 issues done in
Yeah.
14 months. And that's a lot of pages. That's a fucking
Page.
lot of pages, right?
Yeah, plus
But
cover.
this is a that much time spent on just 66 pages, which is just that's 3 issues.
Right. And so, on the coloring aspect, did you handle the coloring, or was somebody else handling the
No,
coloring?
so I was working with Annette Kwok, who's an Australian colorist that I've been working with uh, quite a lot over the last decade.
I'm
Certainly
used
not
to
on everything, but she's sort of worked on most of my covers over the last decade, and when she's been available, a lot of my interiors. And she's just sort of someone that, apart from being incredibly talented, uh, she's kind of really easy to work with, really agreeable. I can give her my sort of reference and my sort of, here are some notes kind of thing, and she'll completely understand what I mean,
Oh, wow.
without too much sort of lost in translation kind of thing. Um, and she's sort of been able to follow me through sort of different styles, because every job I sort of, my style doesn't change, but my rendering of that style does. So, when I was working on Wonder Woman Rebirth, I knew what kind of impression I wanted the art to have, and it
Yeah.
be sort of light and bright and open. And so my line work was very sort of clean and simple by comparison to my work on Earth 2, which was only just before, which was very detailed and very gritty and very shadowy and very, testosterone, lots of sort of muscle contouring
Who doesn't
palaver.
dish of
Yeah,
testosterone?
right. Exactly.
No.
Which is
Here.
very different to my work on Black Magic, which is
Right.
very, very sort of light, delicate line work, because I'm then going into paint.
Right.
And Historia was really a sort of hybrid between a few different styles, because I was painting it, not with the same depth and detail as I do Black Magic, which is fully painted. I
Mhm,
was just painting anything that I felt like was important for the eye to rest on,
mhm.
anything that I felt like was important textural information to hand to Annette. Um, there are some pages or some panels that are fully painted right next to panels that are just line work.
Line work, yeah.
Um, because I'm concentrating on the things that I think are visually important, either to the reader or for Annette in terms of giving her enough information.
Mhm. Do you
Um,
do you think that
and
you're
she's one of the best colorists that I know who can work on grayscale
well,
and it
the
not look muddy.
the fact that you have her sort of, around is a big advantage.
Oh yeah, incredibly. I feel incredibly lucky. Like she's my go-to
Yeah.
anytime I've got a project. It's always like, "Hi, are you available? Will you be
No,
interested?" And sometimes she says no because she's just not.
right.
And I'm just like, nuts. But then it means that I get to work with some other amazing colorists that I end up loving their work of as well.
Do you think that you're I mean, it's interesting when you're talking about the different sort of the difference the different approaches, I guess, to
Mm.
your actual like finish to your work. Do you think that might have to do a bit with like with your background in acting? Like maybe that you're thinking like how are you going to sort of portray this story, and you have to act for everybody, but you have to kind of pick a way to do that.
Yeah, look, it's probably related to that. I think it's also related to the fact that my mother was an artist,
Mm,
and every decade or so, probably less, she just sort of change mediums, and evolve her approach to how she would approach art. And so I kind of liked that 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 kind of challenge and that keeping yourself on your toes and the excitement of it. And when I started, certainly when I started at DC and I was working on monthly books for over a decade, that was all penciling.
yeah.
And so when I finally sort of wrapped up my exclusive contract and sort of, said to DC, I would love to keep doing some work here and there, but I need to do some creator own stuff for my own sort of, stimulation. That I kind of really spent about 6 months working out how I would approach Black Magic
Hmm.
because I needed it to be something other than just penciling. And I didn't want it to just be inking because at the time I still didn't feel particularly confident just
Yeah.
inking. And it was kind of through that and through sort of having been a painter myself when I was, pre comic books. And yes, that sort of very much that sort of idea of film and stage and how tonally you can change your craft by your lighting changes or your whatever special effects or whatever. um it was that thing if I just want to do something a bit different with
Hmm.
what I'm already doing.
Yeah.
And through quite a bit of experimentation with different tools as well as different styles, what I could sort of achieve with the tools, the look that I ended up liking the most was this sort of ink wash painted finish, which of course was also the one that required the most labor.
Right.
But just like Phil,
Yeah.
I do like to punish myself.
Well, there you go. There's
Um,
the commonality between the three of you.
yeah, but I also it's the satisfaction. Like to me, the reason why I don't work digitally because I've definitely experimented with working digitally, and I really appreciate the shortcuts and the ease of use and the ability to edit so
Mm,
quickly and easily. But I really didn't like sitting down at a computer or at a Cintiq or at a tablet. I didn't like the my day
mhm.
having a computer screen. I just didn't that didn't feed me.
Yeah.
I like my paper, I like my pencils, I like my rulers. I like my brushes. I like that sort of Bob Ross, happy accident
Sure.
thing that's too easy to steer away from when you can control every fucking thing.
Well, yeah,
And
undo them.
as hard as it is and as much work as it is, that is the joy I have in my day-to-day life
Hmm.
is that tactile process.
Yeah.
And so, that's why I sort of stuck with it. And I really didn't start sort of inking my own work until um, I was doing Wonder Woman Rebirth, and they were like, who do you want as an inker? And because I was so deeply emotionally invested in this project, because you know
It's
my
wonderful.
my decision, it's Wonder Woman, my decision to work in comics was because of Wonder Woman. Even though I'd drawn Wonder Woman in every other book I'd worked on, this was actually working on a Wonder Woman book, and it was working with Greg Rucka. Whenever any interviewer says, what's your dream project, my answer had always been Wonder Woman. But over the decade, my answer had evolved into working on an origin story of Wonder Woman with Greg Rucka. And then suddenly there it is. We were being offered an origin story of Wonder Woman with Greg Rucka. It was like, holy shit. We just manifested like a out of reality total dream project for the two of us. We were so deeply excited, but I've never been more overwhelmed working on a job emotionally because I'm too invested. I can't just shut up and do it.
Right.
Um, and for that sort of preciousness that I was feeling when they said, who do you want as an inker? I was like, oh fuck, who do I trust? Like, I love the
Sure.
inkers that I've worked with, but what do I want this work to look like, and how do I control that? Because I'm a control freak now. I've been
Yeah.
working on Black Magic for the last year, and I've been able to control everything, and I'm enjoying that, and I don't want to give it up, especially not on this. And so it was my husband that said to me, you should just ink it yourself. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. And he was like, you'll work it out. Just shut up and do it. Just say
Nice.
you're going to ink it yourself. And I was like, oh shit, okay. All right, I'm going to see if they'll let me. And they said, sure, knock yourself out. They were very, very fucking supportive during that
Wow.
project, which was great. Yeah. And so, it was sort of suddenly a bit more work, but, it was paying me more too. So it was great. And I loved it. And I have inked every work of mine since.
I mean, it's interesting that we're living, and I mean, you're doing this traditionally, which is not sort of the sort of status quo of the day, which is people
Yeah.
either are penciling digitally and then inking traditionally over that. Like there are a lot of hybrids happening, or all digital. There's very few people doing everything on the
Yeah.
paper with the tool in hand. So that's no small task. But I think, like, as we sort of move forward in whatever vocation craft we choose, like this sense of, not, I don't know if it's so much control, but it's execution of vision, as the
Mm.
closer we get and the more facility we have with the things that we are sort of engaged with, we sort of like don't want as many things in the way of that image, that final sound or whatever the thing is, to come out there. So I can understand. Uh,
Mm.
time be damned, right?
A little bit, a little bit. I wish I had more time, but I kind of work better under pressure.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I like sitting at my desk. When I don't sit at my desk, um, I get real antsy.
yeah,
You know, I've got all my podcasts. I've got a routine of podcasts that I listen to.
for sure.
I
Yeah.
kind of I like my life as long as I get days off,
Yeah.
and some flexibility. Which on some projects you just 100% don't.
Hmm.
There's just no time. But as long as I get some sense of my life, I'm quite happy sitting at my desk all day, just sort of
Yeah.
with
And
my brushes and my pencils.
it's it's funny because I just 2 days ago I was thinking, and like this wave hit me. I was thinking, and I don't entertain the idea of drawing another comic book, because it's so laborious. But
Mm.
did say to myself, like, if I did draw another comic book, and I've been working, on a digital platform for, over 20 years, I'm like, I think I would do it on paper with a pen,
Right.
and a pencil and a brush. And I don't think I would do it in a digital fashion, because I think I would treat it much more like an art project, far more than just some sort of production project. So,
Yeah. And that's a little bit how I feel, even though it is a production project
you
to the company and to, everybody else. For me, doing, sitting at my desk and doing the job, it
mhm,
has to feel like an art project.
yeah. Well, the
Or
labor,
I
the
don't
labor,
know why I'm here. I
yeah.
I I, I want to enjoy my day.
Hey, you get to wash your hands at the end of the day versus working at a
Yeah.
site you don't. Like, there's no
And
need to wash your hands.
I have a real dinky setup because it makes me happy. I work off a sort of antique dining table, and I have the most hardcore thing that I have is an LED light pad,
Ooh,
and
well,
that's
hey,
it.
yeah,
That's because I do all my roughs on the back of the page.
sure.
Um, that's like the only real fancy thing that I have on my desk, because my Mac is over there, my
Mhm.
scanner is over there. They're just sort of not in my view, so that everything that's on my desk is like some kind of vintage piece of ridiculousness that makes me very happy to sit down at each
Well,
day. And my view is my garden.
I mean, isn't that the thing? You have to be happy with the space and the tools that you're working with, to really,
Yeah.
I mean, we can all make do, and we all
When
have
I
to make do.
Yeah, when I first bought a Cintiq and set it up, I had to sort of buy a new desk to accommodate it and my Mac and all of this kind of stuff. And I was so depressed by how space stationy my studio looked.
Oh,
It just sucked all of the fun for me, because
mhm,
I'm just not a tech interested person.
yeah,
It just sucked all the fun and life out of my little workspace,
yeah,
and it was depressing. It was depressing. It was like I got to a point where it was like, I don't want to look at that anymore. I need to just pack it all up and put it away, because I hate it. I hate it.
yeah,
I don't want that in my life. Now that sort of you can buy sort of little tablets to work on, like,
sure,
even just an iPad Pro will do the trick. That's less overwhelming to me, because my iPad is fucking attached to me
yeah.
surgically.
I had to
Uh,
buy one. I had to buy one, the iPad. My computer died on me, on a trip in New York City, and I was doing client work on this trip,
mm,
and I had to get the work done, so I had to go buy an iPad and figure out how to do the job, on that, and that
right,
was
right.
fine, and I love it. It's fun, and I noodle on it to try to figure out drawing stuff, but like I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, yeah, I mean it's a tool. So what Historia comes out on the 22nd? Am I 7th?
27th.
7th. Okay, so it's post Christmas. So
Yeah. And
everyone,
it's really because, like, we had blown our deadline even when it was announced at San Diego Comic-Con. I was like emailing the editor going, they just announced that we were coming out in like October, and I'm only halfway through. What are you talking about?
right.
You must be kidding. And they were like, yeah, 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 don't worry about it. We'll adjust all of that closer to the time. And when I got my last um, sort of batch of script, it was like the last 15 pages of script. And the editor was like, you take as much time as you need to, but can you give me an idea of how long you think it'll take?
Right.
And I was like, well, look, now that I've got a full batch and I can just get up to speed and stay at speed and blah, 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 I reckon it'll take me, I don't know, 7 or 8 weeks. And he was like, great, if you can make it 7 weeks, then we can make a 2022
Delivery.
release date.
Yeah.
And I was like, if that's important, then sure, I'll aim for that. Which
Wow.
is why, I literally finished 2 weeks ago.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I having made a lot of things in my day, I can only imagine the calisthenics and acrobatics that were going on behind the scenes to get this thing all sort of prepped up as and waiting for these final pages to come in.
Oh yeah. And we ended up adding 2 extra pages because it was like, we want to sort of really sort of sell an idea.
Okay.
And the editor was like, let's just take a couple of extra pages from the back matter stuff. And I was like, great. So it meant like 17 pages in 7 weeks rather than the 15 pages in the 7 to 8 weeks that I had said. But, we got it done. I got it done sort of, on time and comfortably on time.
Mm-hmm.
But as I was sort of doing my final scans and piecing these giant pieces of paper together, because I have to scan it in sections, piecing them together in Photoshop and cleaning it all up. My last hour of doing that before sort of sending the last batch of pages, I could feel my body shutting down. I was like, oh, I usually get like a good, 12 to 24 hours of adrenaline after a deadline, where I sort of, get all that shit done that I haven't done for 2 weeks, like going and doing a supermarket shop and, running some errands that have been waiting for me. And, somewhere on that sort of day after the deadline is when I collapse. I hit a wall and collapse. But I could feel my body collapsing in that last hour. And I was like, oh, shit, I'm shutting down.
You can't do this.
It was a lot just to sort of get it to the thing and then just collapse on the bed and be almost in and out of a coma for about 4 days, while we were sort of also, shuffling together. This is all sort of, Thanksgiving week. So, you guys are all on holiday for a chunk of it, but sort of getting those final colors done, getting the lettering passes, approved and all that kind of stuff. So it was a real, thankfully the bulk of, my job was done for that final week before it went to the printer. But I had to sort of stay cognizant and present so that I could sort of participate in the, notes of that sort of final steps.
Like lying in bed, like holding your phone, like looking at like a response.
100%. I was on the sofa, with my iPad going, can we move that speech balloon just to that spot, please? And that was it. Fucking hot mess.
It was like back
I feel recovered now.
Yeah, I get that. So I'm excited. I can't wait for it to come out. It really is like the amount of work that has gone into these 3 volumes is epic, commensurate to the actual story. So it's kind of an interesting.
The story is so big and so sophisticated and beautiful. Mm-hmm. Like what Kelly Sue has done. Like when she was sort of talking me through the outline, I was sort of, so impressed and overwhelmed by the idea of the story that she was telling anyway. Right. But in the sitting down and actually sort of, the minutiae of how we're getting there, those sort of, little intimate moments that sort of trigger the next bit, that's the, grand bit or the, whatever it might be.
Yep.
It's such an overwhelming story that in those sort of, final days where we were having the lettering proof come through, my volume is pretty devastating. It's pretty devastating. But there is a moment right towards the end, and it's this really sort of kind of innocuous line of dialogue, but it's not at all. It's really loaded. But it's this sort of simple line of dialogue. And every time I get to that point, I just start bawling my eyes out because we've gone through so much trauma. I mean, as a reader, not as as the artist, gone so much trauma to get to this moment. And it's this sort of turning of the tone that it is this one moment. I was saying to sort of Kelly Sue and the editors, I was just like, every time I get to this line, I just burst into tears and I cannot stop crying until, it's like got another 4 or 5 pages to read. But it's this moment of just sort of like, oh my God. I'm overwhelmed by just this really delicate line of dialogue.
Well,
that
if I
just,
start crying, I'll email you.
oh,
I'll
good.
I'm like, I found the spot. I found the spot.
It
Um,
might be different for everybody, but for me, it's just this one
I'll cry.
sort of delicate prompt that
Yeah,
just sends me just I'm already
yeah.
overwhelmed, and that's the thing that just sort of really makes the sort of glassy-eyed heavy tears, turns them into heavy tears.
I think that's what great art should do, right?
One can hope.
Yeah, right. Well, so this is this. Then you're going to go away for 6 months and just land a beach and relax.
I wish.
Yeah.
Now I got to
No,
make some money. This
there
job
you go.
took a long time.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So yeah, I'm taking December off.
Okay, good.
So I'm sort of on a bit of a break now. I'm actually doing a couple of covers during December. And then I'm in the process right now of negotiating what I'll do next. I have to get back to Black Magic
Yeah,
soon, but it's been hard for Greg and I aligning our schedules over the last few years because of his Hollywood career has really sort of gone to the moon,
yeah,
and um just sort of life shit happening, just all this kind of stuff, and me sort of keeping myself busy and keeping myself paid by doing sort of DC stuff. um I'm desperate to get back to Black Magic because we're only halfway through the story that we're trying to tell.
right.
Greg had to sort of quietly say to me a couple of months ago, "Hey, do you have any interest in coming back to Black Magic?" And I'm like, "Fuck yes! It's one of my favorite things to work on." Um, I just, we just need to coordinate and get there. And but first I've got to do like some mainstream DC thing.
Sure.
There are a couple of things that we're sort of talking about at the moment. Um, Lock that in, do something for, I don't know, a few months
Hmm.
to sort of get myself back up to a regular speed on a regular
Yeah.
size page, reacquaint myself
Oh, it's gonna be so
with a
easy.
traditional ratio.
Oh, it's gonna be a breeze.
Oh, look, I hope so. I'm so tired. I'm so
You're
tired.
gonna be sitting back. You're gonna draw. Wait, are you right-handed or left-handed?
Right-handed.
Okay, you'll be drawing with your left hand. It's gonna be so easy.
Oh fuck.
Yeah.
I hope it's like riding a bicycle because
Yeah.
the last year and a bit has been a lot. But yeah, sort of do something sort of fun and regular
Yeah.
with DC for a bit, and then
Get back into your
hopefully
path.
spend the tail end of 23 sort of doing Black Magic. And we've got at least 15 more issues of Black Magic to do,
Okay.
which is in itself probably about 2.5 years.
Right.
We'll see, because it takes quite a long time to do because I paint the thing.
Yeah.
I really shot myself in the
Beautiful.
foot with that one.
Yeah. No, they're
But
absolutely-
I'm
yeah.
so happy with how it looks.
Yeah.
And the sort of the readership, the fans of the book love the story and love the look of the book. So they've been generally very, very patient with us and happy to wait. But I cannot wait to finish this story because I love this story so much.
Oh, that's great.
So yeah, hopefully Greg and I can sort of coordinate our schedules for the next few months. And he needs to get some scripts out for me so that when I start, I can just keep rolling through.
That's good. So here's my one personal question is, do you have sort of the thoughts and visions of writing your own stuff and doing it like your own project?
Yes, I have written stories before, but kind of on purpose, I've written them for someone else to draw.
Sure.
I don't like the idea of falling into a hole of only writing what I want to draw.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to make things easy for myself. So when I've written, it's such a completely different headspace.
Yeah.
My husband, who's a writer, kind of reassures me that I'm pretty good at it, but it takes so much work to get there, and I understand that that's what a writer's life is like because I see it in my husband, I see it in the writers that I'm close to and that I work with. Um, and it's not an enjoyable headspace.
Okay.
I don't enjoy it nearly as much as I do sitting down and painting and drawing.
Yeah.
But I think about it. I do think about it. And at some point in time, I don't know that I ever want to write and draw a series.
Hmm.
When I think about writing, I think more about like writing prose, you
Right.
know.
Yeah.
But again, it's like, ugh, I don't want to torture myself like that. So
It
we'll
is
see.
torture.
We'll see if I'm
It's straight up.
inspired enough.
Yeah. No, it's torture.
That's what
Um,
I hear. I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
want to
no,
do that to myself.
that's what I do, and I love it and I hate it at the same time. So,
Right. I
but
think
yeah.
if I were to ever to do it, it would be once, just to do a thing, because I quite like the idea of like committing to a big long-term creative challenge.
Mhm.
When I do have time away from work, I set myself a creative thing that I've never done before, and I'm just like, I'm just going to learn how to do this as I do this.
Yeah.
And it's usually something around the house. I'm going to learn how to garden. I'm going to learn how to applique a giant fucking thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to learn how to do architectural details in my house. I'm going to learn how to do a thing and just set myself on the path of doing it, because I'm sort of naturally a little bit of a jack of all trades kind of thing, and I like the challenge.
Well,
So
it's that
at
tool.
some point in time, I might decide I'm going to write a thing,
Yeah.
and I will spend a year or so doing that thing and perfecting it as much as possible, and then I'll never do it again.
Well, I think it's a tool. Like we were talking earlier about the idea of switching out your tools. And when
Yeah,
you choose the tool, that your brain has to kind of adjust its wiring to, achieve it. And
yeah,
I think that's the same thing. Even if it's nothing to do with drawing, if it is gardening, or if it's or whatever it is, your brain is figuring out a way to do something new and solve
mm,
these sort of creative problems. And then you kind of take that back to wherever whatever you do as a regular thing. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's all creative to me,
yeah,
and
for sure.
anything that's creative is stimulating, and anything that's sort
Yeah,
of a hard task that I've set, I enjoy. I enjoy sort of the hard task.
right on. All right. I really appreciate you taking the time and talking with me, because
That's my
this
pleasure. It's been really lovely. Thank you for letting me ramble on.
well, it's not a question of rambling. I think it's like all I had to do was just ask the question that like was there, and you have 14 months of backlog. You
Mm.
are letting this is all things that need to be let out you're coming off one of these big projects. So I appreciate you taking the time, and I've really enjoyed this exchange.
My pleasure. Thank you for talking to me too, Alex.
Maybe I'll see you at New York Comic Con or San Diego Comic Con in the future.
You bet.
Yeah, and I can't wait for the book, and I think a lot of people can't wait for Black Magic to come back. So yeah.
Same. Same.
All right. Well, thanks, and for everyone else there, see you next week. All right. Bye.